This is Talk Business and Politics with Roby Brock.
And welcome to the program. I'm Roby Brock. Thanks as always for tuning in. Joining me now is State Senator Jim Hendren. He's been in the middle of the long slog known as the legislative session, but hey, he's a fighter pilot, so this has been child's play for him. Welcome to the program, Senator.
Well, thanks, Roby. It's great to be with you.
Let's begin with the budget. You guys passed a budget just under $5.5 billion for next year. At the 9-month mark of this year, state revenues are about $65 million under budget. I guess my question is, should we be prepared for service cuts in state government?
I don't think so, Roby. I think it's going to work out. There's no question that $300 million in tax cuts over the last 4 years is showing up in the revenue. And for those of us who ran on less taxes, this is what you would expect. So there's some good things that are occurring out of that. One is it took care of the General Improvement Fund debacle that we've had. I don't know that we would have ever done that if the dollars had been sitting there. So it made it much easier to get rid of the General Improvement Funds from a practical matter. And the other thing is it makes us start looking at doing the hard things about cutting government. And so I think it's not necessary that we tax the taxpayers to the point where we plan on a $200 or $300 million surplus. So I think we're in a good position, and we also have plenty of flexibility. We have over $100 million in Category B that if we need to make some cuts, we've already decided where they will be. So I think we're fine.
Well, do you think it would be easier to cut state services in Category B than it would to restore one of those tax breaks that you've given in recent years?
Well, I don't. To restore a tax break in Republican talk is a tax increase, and I don't see a lot of appetite to do that in Little Rock. So again, I think what you're going to find, and again, I think that's why it was important that we have a modest tax cut this time, because we've been aggressive. We've cut $100 million in 13, $100 million in 15, and so we came back with another $50 million in addition to some other tax incentives and tax cuts. So again, I don't think you're going to see a lot of desire to restore those tax cuts or raise taxes. Instead, I think you'll see continued pressure on reducing government spending, which you're already seeing. And one of the bills that didn't get a lot of attention this session, but was a result of the work of the task force, is to change the way we administer Medicaid. And that should, and if it's administered correctly, will save over $1 billion in the next 5 years, of which 30% is general revenue. So those kind of steps forward in reducing spending are what we're going to have to do, and what we really should be doing anyway.
All right, we'll get to healthcare in just a second. In the interim, legislators are going to mirror the old health reform task force that you co-chaired with a blue ribbon panel on tax reform. A, do you want to be a part of that panel? And B, what are your expectations for what that group can actually achieve?
Well, it's not an accident, Roby, that I wrote the majority leader in as a member of the task force, because I do want to be a part of it. And I think that this is a very, perhaps once in a lifetime opportunity to do a top to bottom scrub of our tax code and reform it. We tend to piecemeal things. We tend to look at one exemption at a time. Whichever special interest tends to have the most influence at the time gets a break. And over the years, we've resulted in a tax code that is hard to understand, multiple brackets, property taxes uneven from one part of the state to the other, sales tax exemptions that don't make sense. So we're going to look at it, and we're going to look at it thoroughly and completely. And I hope we'll bring to the General Assembly 2 years from now a plan that completely changes and updates our tax code to make us more competitive with other states. So I do want to be involved in it. I think while sometimes people may think we do too much with task forces, I would say that the reason I like them is because they get results. Standing committees are controlled by special interest, and legislators gravitate to those who sometimes don't necessarily want to do the hard thing. So I think a recommendation from a task force comprised of members with a determination, with the ability to do hard things, gives us an opportunity that we haven't had in decades to really reform the tax code.
Looking forward to that work. I joked last week that a widespread case of gun fever had broken out at the state capitol. What do you think will be the next battle in this debate over gun rights and gun limitations, or do you think the status quo is really where we'll stay?
That's hard to say. There's always going to be pressure to continue to expand, or I guess what I should say better is to remove some of the restrictions on people's Second Amendment rights. We made tremendous progress on that, and I guess what I would say on this, while it may not have been the most graceful process, where we ended I think is good. We ended up with 2 bills, one that said if you have additional training, we will remove some restrictions from your ability to access your right to bear arms, which most people would agree. The second thing we did was we came back and said there are some places that, because of the nature of the environment and because of the fact that they already provide adequate security, we need to allow those places the right to continue to exercise the exemption that they currently have with regard to carrying weapons. So we ended up in a good place, but the fact is there will be continued pressure. There's still some ambiguity on constitutional carry or permitless carry. I saw that I think passed in South Carolina or somewhere this recently. So there'll be continued pressure to look at ways that we can expand the Second Amendment right. But I think what we did this time was a response to the people of Arkansas. It was a solution that fit Arkansas. It made some national groups mad. Obviously, the NRA didn't like the second bill, but nevertheless, I think the people of Arkansas are satisfied with where we ended up.
All right, let's jump to healthcare. We've mentioned it earlier. We have an upcoming special session on healthcare, it looks like. Do you think it's going to be non-controversial and quick, or do you think there's going to be some pushback for what the governor's proposing to do with Arkansas Works?
I really think because of the confinement that we have due to the federal government's lack of movement, I don't anticipate a lot of disagreement. There will be some. There's going to be some who don't like the fact that we're going to put some controls and some restrictions on access to health care. But the fact is, most of us realize that failure to do that is going to continue to put so much pressure on the state budget and on insurance companies that the whole thing collapses. So I think most people are aware of the changes that are coming, basically moving the eligibility back to 100% of the poverty line, to instill some real work requirements. There'll be some other reforms that I think will be broadly supported. It won't be 100%, but I think the support will be there, that I would anticipate a short, somewhat uneventful special session. Now, as soon as I say that, it'll all implode, but that's what I would expect right now.
Well, those are my favorites, the short ones there. You mentioned moving that line on the federal poverty level back from 138 to 100%. Based on some of the estimates that I've seen, as many as 60,000 people could lose their Medicaid expansion insurance as a result of that. My question to you is, what's going to happen to that group in that 101 to 138% range?
Well, the same thing that has happened and is happening in most other states that didn't expand or that have done it in a different method is they'll still be eligible for greatly subsidized insurance on the exchanges. The folks at 100% still get most of the premium paid for on the exchange. So again, they'll have the same ability to purchase subsidized insurance on the exchange and or through their employer. And that's one of the things that's disturbed many of us is some of the folks that are participating in the Medicaid expansion program are doing so, choosing that over currently offered employers' plans. And so some of those folks will go back on their employers' plans because if they're above 100%, they're probably working. And hopefully they're working at a place that provides insurance. And if not, they would have the ability to buy subsidized insurance through the exchange.
Last question for you. We've talked tax reform and all of the potential ramifications for that. You guys really didn't get anything done in terms of long-term highway funding in this session. Does tax reform have to get done first before you can deal with the highway funding plan?
I think it does, Roby, and that's one of the reasons that I avoided and pushed back against any efforts to, whether or not the internet tax was passed or not, to start designating funds before we know what the tax code is going to look like is not the best method. So we need to figure out what our revenue stream is going to look like. There may be some streams that we want to align with the highway program that will grow with the demand for highways. That's part of the problem we have right now, is our revenue stream does not grow as the demand grows. So I think part of our tax task force challenge will be making sure that revenue streams are properly aligned to the needs that they have out there. So I think, again, while we're not a highway task force, there's no question that part of what will be on our mind is what possible revenue streams can we find and can we divert to funding highways. And so, yeah, I think it's important that we will look at the tax code first, and I would anticipate that after we do that and after we have a plan, the governor may want to come back later this year or early next year with a special session to try to implement some of that, because there's no question that we have a need for continued growth in our highways. And so I think you'll see us continue to look down that path.
He's State Senator Jim Hendren. As always, we appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Roby. I appreciate it.